Thank you very much indeed, Yanis, for that introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to speak to all of you here today in Brussels, and thank you very much to all of you for being here today. I'm especially pleased to be addressing the European Policy Centre, an organisation that is currently at the very forefront of discussions on subjects like the recent budget settlement, reform of the banking sector, and how to promote economic growth right across the European Union. For all of those reasons, it is an ideal forum in which to talk about Scotland's referendum on independence that will take place towards the end of next year, and to talk too about the implications of that referendum, and in particular the implications of a yes vote in that referendum for our continuing relationship with the European Union. I speak here today as the Deputy First Minister of a European nation with a very distinct history, culture, legal system, and of course a parliament of our own. However, Scotland's political status is not what I would describe as entirely normal. Our own national parliament in Edinburgh was reconvened in 1999 after a referendum and after an adjournment of almost 300 years. That parliament in Edinburgh has extensive powers over education, health, justice, and much, much more besides. However, key decisions about our day-to-day life and key decisions about our future, whether on economic policy, defence, foreign affairs, the welfare system that we have, are taken not in the Parliament of Scotland, but by governments in the Westminster Parliament. And that creates anomalies, often anomalies which are very obvious here in Brussels, because on a whole range of issues, from fisheries and agriculture to employment and economic development to the digital agenda, the Scottish Government has responsibility for policy making in Scotland, but we have no formal or direct representation when it comes to the many decisions made here, decisions that impact to a greater or a lesser extent on all of these very important areas of responsibility. So the Scottish Government's case for independence is at its heart a very simple one. We believe that the people best able to represent Scotland's interests and to make decisions about Scotland's future are the people who choose to live and work in Scotland. An independent Scottish Government would be able to use the full range of fiscal economic powers to improve the performance of our economy, which over a period of time has lagged behind the growth rates achieved in many other comparable countries. As an independent country, we would be better able to tackle some of the deep-seated inequalities that continue to blight our society and harm some of our most vulnerable and disadvantaged citizens. But in being an independent country, we would recognise, as all nations have to in this world, that independence goes hand in hand with interdependence. That is exactly why an independent Scotland would seek to participate as a full and equal partner in international organisations such as the European Union. So today I want to talk specifically about an independent Scotland's place in the EU. I will outline how we benefit from and indeed contribute to the work of the European Union. I will make clear that regardless of the direction of the UK government policy, Scotland is strongly committed to continuing within the EU as an independent nation. And I will say something about the process by which we would seek to ensure that continuing membership. Earlier this month, as all of you in this audience will be all too well aware, the European Union and the USA announced that they would work to establish a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. That announcement was, in many ways, a reminder of the massive opportunities that European Union membership can bring. President Barroso indicated that when the agreement is up and running, the European economy could get a stimulus of 0.5% of GDP. Now, for Scotland, for whom the USA is our largest trading partner outside the EU itself, such a partnership would be especially good news. However, access to export markets, important though they are, is only one example of the benefits Scotland derives from membership of the EU. The EU has a much wider role to play in promoting economic growth and meeting social challenges. In these areas too, Scotland benefits from its place in the EU, and I would argue very strongly that the EU benefits from the contribution that Scotland makes. After all, we in Scotland face many of the same challenges as the rest of Europe. We need to promote economic growth, we need to tackle global warming, we need to improve energy security and promote a healthier and a fairer society. And we are, as a country, already working with partners right across Europe to tackle these challenges in partnership. Earlier this month it was announced that BioCity in Scotland, working with Dundee University and the Scottish Universities Life Sciences Alliance, would be the site of a major screening centre for the discovery of new drugs under the EU's Innovative Medicines Initiative. And that's just one example, a very good example, but just one example of how our universities, which benefit from EU framework programmes, are making a major contribution to research which will improve the prosperity of Europe's economy and the well-being of its people and society. Scotland, as many of you will be aware, is also a world leader in renewable energy, especially in the development of offshore wind, wave and tidal technology. But we're not acting in isolation. As active partners in the North Sea Offshore Grid Coordination Initiative and the Irish-Scottish Links on Energy study, we're playing a major role in moves towards a more integrated European energy market. And that reflects the huge potential importance of Scotland's natural resources to the European Union. We have the major share of the EU's oil production, almost a quarter of its offshore renewable energy potential, a fifth of its natural gas production, and a twelfth of its seas. Perhaps most importantly of all, though, in addition to the contribution we can make through our natural resources, our research capabilities and our policy interests, there are 5 million people in Scotland who benefit from and contribute to the free market and freedom of movement that the European Union provides. They are already European Union citizens and, I believe, overwhelmingly wish to remain so. And of course, they include approximately 150,000 workers and students who've chosen to come to Scotland from Poland, Ireland, Holland, France, and other countries of the EU. They make a massive contribution to Scotland's culture, to our economy, to our society, and are one of the many reasons why people in Scotland see their future firmly as part of Europe. Despite all those quite considerable mutual advantages that derive from Scotland being an integral part of Europe, it has to be said that our current situation offers no certainty that those advantages would remain. But I should stress that's not because of Scotland's referendum in 2014. Instead, that is a result of the UK's proposed referendum on EU membership in 2017. And I think it is therefore worth commenting on that particular referendum. And I should be clear that I don't do this in order to criticise the UK government. I can do that very easily and do often do that very easily from Edinburgh. But I do think it's important that colleagues in Brussels, and indeed colleagues across the EU, recognise that the perspective of the Scottish Government on our future inside the EU is very different to that of the current UK Government. And public opinion in Scotland is also quite different to public opinion in England. You know, if you look at a recent opinion poll, an Ipsos Mori poll published earlier this month, that showed that more than half of Scots want to stay in the European Union, compared with around a third who would express a preference for leaving. And perhaps most interestingly, the poll suggests that in the event of Scotland becoming independent, with the ability that that would give us to better articulate, assert and protect our vital national interests, support for membership of the EU would be stronger still, at more than 60%. And all of that contrasts with recent polling in England, which has suggested that a majority of people are in favour of leaving the European Union. And this divergence of views between Scotland and elsewhere in the UK is not a recent or a short-term phenomenon. Now, I wouldn't stand here and suggest for a moment that Euroscepticism doesn't exist at all in Scotland, but it is nevertheless the case that it has never had the same potency in Scotland as it has had and continues to have in parts of England. If you take, for example, the last Scottish parliamentary elections in 2011, UKIP, the UK Independence Party, whose growing influence might be responsible for David Cameron's EU referendum policy, UKIP in that Scottish election received fewer than 1% of the votes. So I believe that the reason for this is that people and politicians in Scotland recognise that EU membership is in our national interest. And that's not to say that we think the EU is perfect. It's not to say that we don't think there's a substantial case for reform of key aspects of EU policy and governance. On the contrary, the Scottish Government understands and supports the case for reform of the EU. And we're already contributing, I hope, positively to the process of amending the common fisheries policy, for example. We also want to see more ambitious EU targets on carbon emissions, and we're strongly supportive of increased transparency and accountability in how the EU does its business. However, we believe that these reforms are best achieved from within the EU through constructive dialogue and alliance building with other like-minded member states. And that doesn't seem to be the road that David Cameron is set upon. And I will be very frank with you, I have deep concerns about the direction of that UK policy. Instead of leading the EU, the UK is in danger of sleepwalking towards the exit of the EU. And such an outcome for Scotland would be contrary to public opinion, and I believe against the national interest of Scotland. All of that said, however, my hope and expectation, as you've probably been able to guess by now, is that before the UK government holds its planned referendum, Scotland will already have become an independent nation. As you might expect, and I want to be very clear about this, the Scottish Government has thought deeply about the process by which an independent Scotland would continue as a member of the EU. And that process is inextricably linked to the question of how Scotland will become independent. And so it's worth noting from the start a particular characteristic of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom came into being as a union. It is not, and it never has been, a unitary state. It's always been possible to dissolve the UK if the people so choose. And the fact that Scotland has the right to become independent is recognised by the UK government. Last October, the UK Prime Minister David Cameron and Scotland's First Minister Alex Salmond signed the Edinburgh Agreement. That Edinburgh Agreement made it clear that the UK government would give the Scottish Parliament unchallengeable authority to organise a referendum on whether Scotland should become an independent country. Following that agreement and following the subsequent legislation at Westminster, the Scottish Government will next month introduce a referendum bill into the Scottish Parliament. And the nature of the process that will lead us to a democratic referendum late next year, I think demonstrates something very important about Scotland's constitutional debate. Although the UK government and the Scottish government disagree fundamentally and often very passionately about the merits of independence, the referendum itself will take place with our shared consent and cooperation. And that means that Scotland's referendum takes place in a different context from many of the other debates and discussions about sovereignty taking place elsewhere around the world. Indeed, perhaps the most significant clause in the Edinburgh Agreement is that which states clearly that both the Scottish and the UK governments will accept the outcome of the referendum and that we will work together constructively to implement that outcome in the best interests of the people of Scotland and indeed of the rest of the UK. And it's with that important commitment in mind that the Scottish Government published a paper 3 weeks ago which set out our expectation that following a yes vote in the referendum, Scotland would become independent by March 2016. And it's interesting to note, as an aside, that that timetable has been described as realistic by the UK government's own independent legal expert, Professor James Crawford. By March 2016, it is our expectation and intention that we would have agreed necessary transitional arrangements with the UK government, and we would have established a constitutional platform for independence. We also expect that Scotland's independence would have been accepted by the international community and that agreement would have been obtained for our continuing membership of the European Union. We are, as you would expect us to be, are already carrying out detailed work on a number of the issues that would require to be resolved to secure that continuing membership. For example, the Independent Fiscal Commission that's part of the First Minister's Council of Economic Advisers has already, very recently, published a substantial report on the macroeconomic framework of an independent Scotland. And later this week, we will publish a paper on how economic and competition regulation could work in an independent Scotland. We've shared ideas and learned a great deal from international examples in preparing this latter paper, and we are particularly grateful for the cooperation of the Dutch administration in discussing possible regulatory models. We have, as many of you may have seen in the media, also corresponded with the European Commission about Scotland's continuing EU membership in the event of a yes vote next year. The Commission, however, has made clear that it will only give a detailed opinion if presented with a precise scenario by an EU member state. Now, we consider, and I am strongly of the view, that it is possible to prepare and publish a precise scenario that would provide the European Commission with the information it needs to consider Scotland's intention to remain in the EU after independence, and we continue and will continue to call on the UK government as the existing member state to join with us in making such a submission. And all of this work should, and indeed is intended to show, that the Scottish Government does not take the process of EU membership for granted. We understand that it is essential to respect the legitimacy of existing EU treaties. We also understand that our continued membership will require negotiations and indeed the agreement of other nations. To secure that agreement, Scotland would make a notification of intent in autumn 2014 following a yes vote in the referendum. And that notification would make it clear that we want to continue within the European Union as an independent nation. We would then start those negotiations as soon as possible. But we would begin those negotiations as a nation which would be a net contributor to the EU budget and whose people are already EU citizens. We would begin these negotiations as a nation that already applies the body of EU law and policy, and as a devolved government has demonstrated its capacity to transpose and implement EU legislation. We would begin the negotiations as a nation keen to be an equal and constructive partner in the EU, recognising its benefits, participating in dialogue about its future, and contributing fully to its development and its growth. And we would begin the negotiations by seeking to apply the principle of continuity of effect. In other words, on issues like the euro, the Schengen or the rebate, our aim would be to retain the prevailing terms of Scotland's membership. There is, of course, and I'm sure there'll continue to be, much discussion in this debate of law and of process. But ultimately, the most powerful case for Scotland's continued membership will not be based on law or process. It will be based on common sense, reality, and mutual self-interest. And all of these point overwhelmingly to the desirability of negotiations being concluded before Scotland becomes independent, so that our continued membership is a seamless process. After all, the alternative to that would benefit absolutely nobody. I mean, just think about it for a moment. If there was a gap in Scottish membership, new negotiations would be needed to allow other EU fishing fleets to fish in Scottish waters. 150,000 EU citizens who have chosen to make Scotland temporarily or permanently their home would face uncertainty about their future status. I would argue that the very founding principles of the European Union would be traduced. It would, I argue, be simpler, fairer and more efficient for all nations if people in Scotland could retain the status that they overwhelmingly want, the status as citizens of the European Union and proud and constructive partners in the European family. So, ladies and gentlemen, for me, as I said at the start of this speech, independence goes hand in hand with interdependence. That's one of the reasons why, for me, and indeed for many Scots, a sense of nationalism always goes together with a strong sense of internationalism. Scotland is a nation that has made a big contribution to the world in the past. We're often said to have punched well above our weight in what we have contributed to the modern world. But more importantly, we have a huge amount to offer the world in the future. I think we are already demonstrating that in our interactions with European partners, in our work in energy, on life sciences, on reform of the common fisheries policy, and in many, many other areas. But I believe that we can and we will make our biggest contribution as an independent nation, taking our own place in the world stage and acting as equal partners with our friends across the UK and with fellow nations in Europe and around the world. And that is why, after Scotland becomes independent, as I hope it does, that we intend to remain part of the European family. And it's why Scottish membership of the European Union will be good for us, it will be good for other individual nations, and it will be fundamentally good for Europe as a whole. So thank you very much indeed for listening, and I now look forward very much to answering your questions and sharing in the discussion.